My name is Serena Vance. I am 32 years old, and I run regional operations for a premier luxury hospitality group. We oversee 6 massive, high-end dining venues that comfortably seat over 4,000 demanding guests every single week. I know exactly how a highly complex restaurant check moves from the chaotic kitchen to the pristine dining table, the exact same way most ordinary people know how to tie their shoes. Numbers, logistics, profit margins, and human behavior. These are the things I read flawlessly. So, when my parents suddenly called me after 3 agonizing years of absolute, freezing silence and warmly invited me to an intimate dinner to make amends, I should have asked exactly one vital question before I ever agreed to go. I should have asked, who is actually sitting at that table? I absolutely didn't ask. I naively drove 45 minutes across the city to the Obsidian Room, walked confidently through the heavy, brass-handled front doors, and found exactly 16 members of my estranged family already comfortably seated around a massive, candle-lit banquet table. The table was completely covered in colossal seafood towers, sizzling tomahawk steaks, and a $500 bottle of vintage Cabernet that they had happily started pouring long before I ever pulled my car into the parking lot. My father looked up from the head of the table, flashed a predatory smile, and casually said the exact words I had spent my entire adult life trying to outrun. "You're paying tonight, right, Serena? You owe us that much." He genuinely thought he had brilliantly cornered me in a public place. He absolutely hadn't counted on the 2 quiet sentences I was about to whisper to our exhausted waiter, or on the devastating truth his own credit card was about to scream to the entire family exactly 15 minutes later. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the only channel where the quiet, reliable people finally face impossible family manipulations and walk out with their absolute dignity entirely intact. If you have ever been the designated scapegoat, the one expected to endlessly pay, to fix every crisis, and to stay completely quiet, this story is entirely for you. Please drop a comment below telling me your thoughts, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, because this one is going to stay with you for a very long time. But I desperately need to back up a few weeks before that extravagant dinner. Before the parking lot completely full of family cars I instantly recognized, and long before my arrogant father tried to hand me a dinner bill the size of a standard monthly mortgage payment. I need to explicitly tell you exactly who I was the quiet morning that innocent-looking invitation arrived on my phone, because the old version of me is exactly the person they were banking on exploiting, and it is the exact version of myself I had already violently stopped being. I manage 6 luxury restaurants. I do not own them. I fiercely manage them. I stubbornly built my entire career from the absolute ground up, starting by bussing sticky, dirty tables at a loud, chaotic sports bar when I was barely 17 years old. I remember sitting on my high school bus the next morning, my hair still smelling like rancid fryer oil, desperately studying for my exams. I was a front door hostess at 19, a lead server at 21, a ruthless floor manager by 24, and the regional director of operations by the time I turned 30. I am not extraordinarily wealthy. I live in a modest 2-bedroom condo that is entirely paid off. I have a secure retirement account that I absolutely never touch, and I have exactly one singular indulgence in my entire life: cold, sparkling water. Still or sparkling, it absolutely does not matter. That is exactly what I order to drink when I eat out, every single time without fail. My corporate staff assumes it is just a quirky health habit. It is absolutely not a quirk. When you grow up constantly paying for everyone else's expensive steaks and bad decisions, you quickly learn to keep your own personal tab small enough that you can easily walk away from the table whenever you need to. That specific Tuesday morning, I was sitting alone in my quiet office, meticulously reviewing a massive $100,000 vendor contract for imported truffles. It was the exact kind of busy, focused Tuesday that makes you blissfully forget that not everyone's entire life runs on logical spreadsheets and operational pars. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the glass desk. I casually glanced down, and I physically felt something freezing cold settle deep behind my ribs. 3 entire years of absolute, punishing silence from my blood relatives, and there it was, glaring at me, a glowing notification from the family group chat that I had been viciously removed from the very day I became the family's designated villain. The Vance family had added me back to the chat. I stared at that digital notification for a full, paralyzed minute before I finally gathered the courage to open it. The chat history was completely, meticulously clean. There was absolutely nothing visible above my mother's newest incoming message, which meant they had either entirely cleared the old history to hide their tracks, or, significantly more likely, they had been running a second, highly active group chat entirely without me for the last 1,000 days. My mother, Evelyn's message was incredibly warm, highly careful, and sounded deeply rehearsed. She wrote that she and my father, Richard, had been doing a massive amount of spiritual reflecting, and that they desperately wanted to invite me to a private dinner at the Obsidian Room to finally start healing as a united family. Just the 4 of us, she typed explicitly. Me, your father, you and your sister, Harper. A small, quiet dinner. A fresh start. And then came a second, rapid-fire message exactly 30 seconds later, containing the exact, sickening line that should have told me absolutely everything I needed to know. Family always takes care of family, Serena sweetheart. It is high time we finally remembered that. Family takes care of family. My mother used to say that exact, manipulative phrase when I was 19 years old, and she desperately needed my hard-earned waitress tips to cover the overdue electric bill. She said it again when I was 23, and my father absolutely needed a reliable co-signer on a massive loan for a new truck. She said it when my sister Harper's very first luxury apartment deposit fell through, and I quietly, seamlessly paid the difference so she wouldn't lose the lease. Family takes care of family had absolutely always meant exactly one thing in the Vance household. Serena takes care of the family. I read her glowing message twice. I sharply noticed that my mother hadn't typed the word sorry. She absolutely hadn't said, we were wrong. She had simply said it was time to heal. Passive voice, no subject, absolutely no one taking personal responsibility for the emotional wreckage. I slowly typed back exactly 4 words. I will be there. Then I deliberately set my phone face down on the desk, took a deep breath, and went right back to the truffle contract, desperately pretending my hands weren't physically shaking. Exactly 3 years ago, my younger sister Harper impulsively decided she was going to open a high-end wellness and beauty spa. She had absolutely no coherent business plan, 0 market feasibility studies, and no financial projections. She simply wanted to open a spa because she had seen a gorgeous, aesthetic one in Los Angeles with living moss walls and a matcha bar, and her delusional brain thought, I could easily do that. She was 26 years old. She had never successfully managed so much as a local lemonade stand, and she suddenly needed a massive $100,000 small business loan to secure the commercial lease. The corporate bank naturally said yes, but only with a highly qualified cosigner. And that wealthy cosigner was, by family default, supposed to be me. Evelyn called me on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Richard sat right beside her on the couch, his arms defensively folded, already radiating intense anger before I had even answered the phone. Harper desperately needed the massive loan. The luxury spa was her ultimate dream. I had a flawless credit score, a highly stable corporate job, and an extensive, pathetic history of always saying yes to them. Just physically sign the bank papers, Serena, my father demanded. I calmly asked to see Harper's detailed business plan first. Harper didn't even have a rough draft. I logically asked about her projected profit margins, her commercial lease terms, and her expensive supplier contracts. Harper just stared at me through the video call, exactly like I had deeply insulted her soul. My mother's voice instantly went completely flat and venomous. She is your blood sister, Serena. You absolutely do not need a corporate spreadsheet to prove you love your own sister. I firmly said no, not because I didn't deeply love Harper. I truly did, But I had spent enough agonizing years in the brutal hospitality industry watching naive people blindly pour their entire life savings into flashy concepts with absolutely no financial foundation. And I knew exactly what $100,000 of someone else's toxic debt looks like at 3 o'clock in the morning. When the business is failing, the lights are off, and the crushing bank loan is still due. My father stood up violently from the couch. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the camera lens and said the exact, unforgivable thing that permanently closed the door for 3 long years. If you will not financially fund this family, Serena, you are absolutely not a part of it anymore. I quietly closed my laptop. The very next morning, I had been permanently removed from the Vance family group chat. Nobody called my phone. Nobody texted to check on me. For 3 entire years, I was the malicious, greedy daughter who loved her corporate money significantly more than her own sister's dreams. Here is the absolute hardest part for me to admit out loud. The deafening silence from my family almost completely broke my spirit. Not because they were factually right. I knew with absolute certainty that they weren't, but because I deeply, pathetically missed being desperately needed by them. That is the actual bleeding wound. And it took me 2 grueling years and a brilliant therapist named Dr. Eris to finally name that wound properly. I had been the designated family fixer since I was barely 17. My very first corporate paycheck went directly to household groceries. My annual tax refunds entirely funded my mother's extensive dental work. When my father's truck transmission violently blew out on the highway, I secretly paid for the entire mechanical rebuild, and I lied, telling him it was miraculously covered under a factory warranty because I knew his fragile, masculine pride would never, ever accept a direct financial handout from his 22-year-old daughter. When Harper got married the first time, I entirely covered the expensive florist, the luxury photographer, and half the catered reception. And I sat there and smiled politely while my mother gave a tearful, glowing toast to the room about how she had raised 2 incredibly strong, independent girls. 2 strong girls, and exactly 1 massive bill. I didn't do all of those things because I am inherently a generous saint. I did it because I had psychologically learned, somewhere around the age of 15, that the absolute fastest, most efficient way to keep the volatile peace in my chaotic family was to make absolutely sure nobody ever had to ask for money twice. Ask once, Serena immediately pays, everyone is blissfully happy, and the dinner table remains peaceful and quiet. I had ruthlessly trained them. I had actively taught my own parents that my personal wallet was just a magical vending machine. Insert emotional guilt, instantly receive a massive check. And when the vending machine finally flashed out of order during Harper's spa debacle, they absolutely didn't try to troubleshoot the machine. They simply unplugged it from the wall, turned their backs, and walked away. So when my mother's manipulative message popped up on my screen after 3 years of icy exile, "Family takes care of family, Serena sweetheart," I physically felt the old, desperate reflex fire deep in my chest, exactly like an old muscle I hadn't stretched in years. The voice screamed, "Go fix it. Pay absolutely whatever it costs to make them smile again. Make the house quiet and happy." But thankfully, I also clearly heard Dr. Eris's voice in my head, as steady and unrelenting as a metronome. "You aggressively taught them that you would absolutely always pay, Serena. That was entirely your mistake to fix. And you do not fix it by paying more money. You fix it by completely stopping." My senior operations coordinator, a sharp woman named Jessica, explicitly told me not to go to the dinner. She sat directly across from me at a lunch meeting the day after the invitation arrived and said, "Serena, this entire setup has the word ambush written all over it in neon lights." And I vividly remember laughing out loud because Jessica had absolutely never even met my toxic family, yet she could see their strategy infinitely clearer than I could. My executive chef, a massive guy named Thomas, simply said 2 words, "Absolutely don't." But I had already firmly decided to go. Not because I foolishly believed their lies, and absolutely not because I expected a genuine apology. I desperately wanted to sit directly across from my parents and find out, once and for all, whether 3 years of exile had actually changed a single thing about their souls, or whether the agonizing silence had just been a significantly longer version of the exact same conversation we always had. The one where I was expected to sit, listen, agree, and pay. I desperately wanted final closure, even if that closure meant permanently confirming the door was nailed shut with iron spikes. I set one unbreakable operational rule for myself. One dinner. Keep it entirely civil. Absolutely no money changes hands. And if the room felt even slightly toxic, I would stand up and leave the restaurant long before the dessert menus ever arrived. I wrote that strict rule on a yellow sticky note and pressed it directly to the center of my steering wheel on the evening of the dinner. One dinner, then home. That battered sticky note was still clinging to my steering wheel when I slowly pulled my car into the sprawling parking lot of the Obsidian Room, and my heart violently dropped into my stomach as I began to count the cars. I had deliberately dressed down for the evening. Simple black slacks, a modest gray silk blouse I usually wear to boring vendor meetings, comfortable flat shoes, and absolutely no flashy jewelry except for the small, elegant silver watch I bought myself the year I was promoted to regional director. I dressed down because I absolutely didn't want to walk into the Obsidian Room looking like I was aggressively flaunting my wealth. My family already falsely believed I thought I was better than them. The absolute truth was, I still drove a reliable 8-year-old sedan, and I meticulously meal prepped my lunches on Sunday afternoons, just like half the working professionals in America. The drive to the restaurant took 45 minutes. I played absolutely no music in the car. My hand stayed locked at 10 and 2 on the wheel, somewhere around the highway merge. My stomach started to violently tighten in a way I instantly recognized. It is the exact same physiological dread I get when a massive walk-in freezer completely fails on a Friday night during the dinner rush, and I know the next 6 hours are going to be absolute, unmitigated hell. Pure instinct. My body inherently knew something that my logical brain was still desperately trying to negotiate with. I genuinely almost turned the car around at the final exit ramp. Almost. But I kept driving. The Obsidian Room sat like a glowing fortress at the absolute end of a high-end commercial strip I hadn't visited in years. The exceptionally expensive side of town. The kind of place where the massive parking lot is impeccably landscaped with exotic trees, and the hostesses all wear designer black dresses. My father's heavy truck was parked prominently in the third row. My mother's sedan was parked right next to it. Fine, that was expected. But then, my eyes locked onto Aunt Martha's pristine white SUV. Then Uncle Thomas's customized Jeep. Then Harper's little hatchback, still sporting the peeling bumper sticker from the terrible business idea that had caused this entire rift. 3 more vehicles I instantly recognized. 2 more I didn't. My stomach completely bottomed out before I even put the car in park. Just the 4 of us, my mother had explicitly, deliberately typed. I counted exactly 10 recognizable family vehicles. I sat frozen in my car for 2 full minutes, the engine completely off, my hands gripping the steering wheel, just reading that yellow sticky note. One dinner, then home. The absolute smartest thing I could have possibly done would have been to instantly reverse out of that spot, drive the 45 minutes back to my quiet condo, eat leftover chicken soup, and absolutely never, ever think about the Vance family reunion I hadn't been invited to, or apparently had been maliciously invited to without being told the actual guest list. But I stubbornly got out of the car. I smoothed down my gray blouse. I locked the doors and walked deliberately toward the glowing entrance. Because I was 32 years old, I had spent 3 grueling years learning how to stop running away, and I was absolutely not going to start running again in a restaurant parking lot on a Thursday evening. The front doors were massive, heavy glass with polished brass handles, the exact kind of doors that subtly whisper, "Entrees start at $55 before you even look at a menu." Inside, the elegant lobby smelled intensely of burning rosemary, warm artisanal bread, and generational money. A gorgeous hostess in a black dress smiled warmly and checked her glowing iPad screen. Vance? Party of 4? I asked quietly. I watched her professional smile falter just a fraction. Ah, the Vance party, she nodded, her eyes flashing with a look of deep institutional sympathy. Your massive party is already seated in the back alcove, ma'am. She said it exactly the way hostesses say things when they have been dealing with a chaotic, demanding large group for over an hour and are trying incredibly hard not to look visibly stressed. I instantly recognized the expression. I had worn that exact mask myself 1,000 times. She grabbed exactly one menu and led me toward the very back of the opulent dining room. I could easily hear them long before I could actually see them. Roaring laughter, the aggressive clinking of fine crystal glasses, and my Aunt Martha's unmistakable, piercing cackle cutting entirely through the sophisticated murmur of every other table in the building. One dinner, then home. I slowly turned the corner, and I finally saw the table. 16 massive, upholstered chairs. Every single one of them was completely filled, except for the one empty chair at the absolute far end of the room, positioned directly across from my father. The banquet table stretched the entire length of the private dining alcove. Thick white linen, heavy silver flatware, and glowing candles resting in low, crystal holders. But it was the food that made my blood run cold. There were massive platters I could easily identify and price from 10 feet away. Colossal Maine lobster tails fanned elegantly across crushed ice towers. Sizzling tomahawk steaks presented on heavy wooden carving boards. A massive artisanal charcuterie board the size of a coffee table and sitting dead center in the middle of the chaos. A bottle of wine I intimately recognized from elite vendor tastings. A 2018 vintage Reserve Cabernet. Retail price in a restaurant, easily around $500. It was already half empty. They had been here a very long time. They had been aggressively ordering hard. The hostess paused slightly at the edge of the alcove and shot me a look that translated perfectly across every luxury restaurant I have ever managed in my life. Good luck. Then she leaned in slightly closer and whispered quietly, Your father put a major credit card down to hold the reservation tonight, ma'am. Just so you are aware, we strictly require a card on file for parties over 12. I silently, permanently filed that massive operational detail away in the back of my mind. His credit card was on file. He had legally secured the table. And yet, somehow, looking at the sheer gluttony on the table, I intuitively knew the massive bill was absolutely never supposed to land on his plate. My mother saw me first. She dramatically stood up with both arms thrown wide open, and absolutely every head at the massive table turned to stare. Serena! Oh, sweetheart! Just look at you, she cheered. Applause broke out. Actual, literal applause. Exactly as if I was a heroic, returning soldier coming home from a war, and not the discarded daughter they had entirely ghosted for over 1,000 days. Uncle Thomas whistled loudly. Aunt Martha dramatically dabbed her dry eyes with a cloth napkin. Harper lazily raised her crystal wine glass and flashed a smile. The exact kind of smile that shows all of your teeth but carries absolutely zero warmth behind the eyes. 16 people, consuming tomahawk steaks and $500 Cabernet. Just the 4 of us, my mother had written. I slowly walked to the end of the table and sat down. What else do you do when 16 people are intensely watching your every move? The heavy chair is already pulled out, and a waiter is actively pouring iced water into your glass before your purse even hits the floor. I sat down and I smiled, because that is exactly what 15 years of high-end, front-of-house hospitality training gives you. The terrifying ability to smile warmly and politely while your brain is simultaneously running a full-scale, lethal threat assessment at maximum speed. My mother settled happily back into her seat, absolutely beaming. We wanted it to be a massive surprise, Serena. The entire family back together, just like the good old times. I thought it was just the 4 of us, I said quietly, my voice perfectly level. My mother waved her hand dismissively, exactly like she was swatting away an annoying fly. Well, once Martha heard we were going out, and then Thomas, and then your cousin Tara, the list just grew. You know exactly how family is, sweetheart. I knew exactly how my family was. I slowly scanned the massive table. My father sat at the head, carving a piece of premium steak exactly like it was a Thanksgiving turkey. Harper sat to his left, her glowing phone in one hand, her wine glass in the other, endlessly scrolling through something I couldn't see. Aunt Martha and Uncle Thomas confidently anchored the middle of the table. Cousins I hadn't spoken to since Barack Obama was president filled the remaining seats. Tyler, Megan, Jake, two wives I had met exactly once, and Aunt Martha's random next-door neighbor, who I had absolutely never seen before in my entire life, but who was apparently happily eating a $50 lobster tail on whatever grand occasion this was supposed to be. The expensive wine was flowing like water. The massive platters were half demolished. They had been sitting here for at least an entire hour before I was scheduled to arrive, and they had arrogantly ordered absolutely everything on the menu that didn't require a second mortgage. My mother leaned across the linen tablecloth and squeezed my hand tightly. See, Serena? Family always takes care of family. There it was again. The exact same 5 words, delivered with the exact same warm, deceptive packaging, aimed squarely at the exact same target. I squeezed her hand back, and I said absolutely nothing. I was busy counting the plates. My father is the specific kind of arrogant man who orders for the entire table. He doesn't ask what you want. He simply orders it. He waved the waiter over. The young guy was barely out of his teens, wearing a pristine black uniform, and looking exactly like he was running purely on adrenaline and deep anxiety. My father rattled off massive additions without even glancing at a menu. Bring us another huge round of the lobster tails, 2 more of those steak boards, and bring us another bottle of that Cabernet, the reserve one, the good stuff, he commanded, speaking loud enough for the wealthy tables on either side of us to clearly hear his boasting. He then pulled his credit card from his leather wallet, holding it up high between 2 fingers, exactly like a stage magician showing the audience a coin before a grand trick. Put absolutely all of it on this card, son, he told the young waiter. We are heavily celebrating tonight. The waiter, his brass name tag read Julian, scribbled frantically on his notepad, nodded, and disappeared toward the kitchen with the desperate look of someone who urgently needed a smoke break. I watched my father proudly tuck the credit card back into his wallet with a smug little pat. Something was completely, fundamentally off. I had grown up watching my father aggressively argue with mechanics over the price of a simple oil change. I had seen him scream at cashiers over expired coupons. Richard Vance did not order $500 bottles of wine. He did not wave credit cards around like victory flags. This was a highly orchestrated theatrical performance, and the entire production was aimed directly at me. Look how incredibly well we are doing, Serena. Look how little we ever needed your pathetic money. Except the car I saw in the parking lot was the exact same heavy truck from 5 years ago, complete with a rusted dent in the rear panel he had never bothered to fix. And my mother's handbag, the designer purse she had carried since I was in high school, sat on the chair beside her with a severely cracked leather strap, held desperately together by a hidden safety pin. They were fiercely performing massive wealth. I just didn't know the exact price of admission yet. The small, passive-aggressive cuts started right around the arrival of the second bottle of wine. Aunt Martha leaned entirely across Uncle Thomas and loudly said, "It must be so incredibly nice running all those fancy, luxury restaurants while the absolute rest of us are struggling to clip grocery coupons." She laughed loudly when she said it, the exact way toxic people laugh when they desperately want you to know they're being entirely serious. Cousin Megan innocently asked if I ever felt guilty living such a lavish, successful lifestyle while my poor parents were going through such a rough patch. I didn't know about any rough patch. Absolutely nobody had told me about a rough patch. Harper, without ever looking up from her glowing phone screen, muttered she wouldn't know anything about a rough patch. She hasn't bothered to be around for years. Each comment landed with the stunning precision of something heavily rehearsed. Not fully scripted, exactly, but perfectly aligned, the way a choir finds the exact same musical note without needing a conductor. They had been talking about me endlessly, about my absence, about my corporate money, about my lifestyle, and they had arrived tonight with a completely shared, unified understanding of the narrative. Serena left us. Serena has plenty of cash. Serena owes us big time. Aunt Martha delivered the ultimate thesis statement. She reached her hand across the table, took my hand exactly like she was comforting a widow at a funeral, and said softly, "Family doesn't keep score of money, dear." I genuinely almost laughed directly in her face. Family doesn't keep score? This was coming from a bitter woman who had completely stopped speaking to her own daughter-in-law for 6 months over a seating arrangement at Thanksgiving. I didn't laugh. I gently, firmly pulled my hand back from her grasp and picked up my glass. Sparkling water, the absolute only thing sitting in front of me on the massive table, the only thing I had personally ordered. The stark contrast was almost hilarious. 16 people, practically swimming in colossal lobster shells and vintage Cabernet, and me holding a simple glass of San Pellegrino, sitting at the far end of the table looking exactly like a sober, designated driver at a wild bachelorette party. Julian, the young, exhausted waiter, passed right behind my chair, and I caught his eye. "Just the sparkling water tonight, ma'am?" he asked quietly, his eyes darting to the chaos on the table. "Just the water," I confirmed softly. He nodded slowly, exactly like he understood a deeply profound secret I hadn't even said out loud. Let me briefly tell you about Julian. He was maybe 19 years old, built thin the way restaurant kids always are before they learn how to quickly eat meals standing up over a trash can between massive dinner rushes. He moved incredibly fast but careful, the exact way new servers move when the party table is way too big, the order is completely overly complicated, and they know in their bones that one single dropped plate means a devastating conversation with a manager they absolutely cannot afford to have. I intimately recognized absolutely everything about his posture, because I had been him, a terrified 17-year-old girl, completely overwhelmed, learning the hard way that the wealthy guests who snap their fingers at you are absolutely always the ones who leave the worst tips. Julian was single-handedly managing our massive 16-top table. He never once complained. He never sighed. He seamlessly refilled my sparkling water without ever needing to be asked. And when he quietly set the glass back down, he caught me intensely watching the noisy table with an expression of pure dread that I probably should have hidden significantly better. "Long night ahead," he murmured under his breath. I almost told him the absolute, terrifying truth. Instead, I just looked up at him and whispered, "You're doing a genuinely great job tonight." He blinked at me, visibly startled, exactly like he had completely forgotten that wealthy customers were actually capable of speaking to him like a human being. Then he stood up about half an inch taller, his shoulders relaxing, and moved seamlessly on to refill Uncle Thomas's heavy wine glass. I watched him walk away, and I deeply thought about the scared, younger version of myself that used to carry for burning hot plates up her forearms, hiding her tears in the freezing walk-in cooler on the impossible nights. That young, desperate girl had absolutely no idea she would eventually end up sitting on the wealthy side of a table exactly like this one, sitting directly across from the toxic family that aggressively molded her into a silent fixer, currently being cornered into writing one more massive, extortionate check. But that girl would absolutely understand what I was about to do. She would understand it perfectly. I politely excused myself to the restroom right around the 40-minute mark. I desperately needed exactly 2 minutes of peace without Aunt Martha's endless, petty commentary, and I needed a heavy wooden door that I could lock behind me. The Obsidian Room's restroom was the luxurious kind, featuring thick cloth hand towels, artisanal lavender soap, and massive, full-length mirrors with flawless lighting. I slowly turned on the golden faucet, letting the freezing cold water run aggressively over my wrists, the exact grounding technique you use when you urgently need your racing heart rate to cooperate with your logical brain. And then I saw it, resting carelessly on the very edge of the polished marble countertop, the screen still glowing brightly, encased in a cover covered in gaudy daisy stickers. Harper's cell phone. She must have come into the restroom right before me and carelessly left it behind when she got distracted by her own reflection. Harper recklessly left expensive things everywhere. It was honestly one of the very few chaotic traits we shared. I absolutely did not plan to look at it. I want to be brutally clear about that fact. But the screen was glaringly bright, and the banner notification hovering at the very top was from a group chat I had absolutely never been added to. And the preview text visible on the screen was more than enough to completely stop my hand mid-reach for a paper towel. The group chat was explicitly titled Dinner Strategy. There were exactly 3 members in the group: Mom, Dad, and Harper. The latest message, sent exactly 4 days ago, was from my mother. The preview text showed the exact words I can still recite perfectly from memory. Don't tell Serena it's everyone tonight. Once she's there, she won't dare. The preview message brutally cut off at the banner's edge. My pulse remained completely steady. My hands were dry. I slowly picked up the glowing phone the exact same way I would pick up a suspicious vendor invoice that didn't add up correctly. Not violently angry, not shocked, just calmly confirming the devastating truth the numbers were already telling me. I scrolled up the screen. The full, sickening message read, "Don't tell Serena it's everyone tonight. Once she's there, with the entire family watching her every move, she won't dare say no to the bill. She absolutely never could handle a public scene." Right below it, my father had replied, "Just make absolutely sure she sits at my end of the table. I'll handle the actual financial ask when the time is right." Harper's eager contribution was time-stamped exactly 2 minutes later. Order the really good stuff before she even gets there. Once the food is on the table, she can't exactly send it back. LOL. I kept scrolling up, the betrayal washing over me like ice water. 3 entire weeks of coordinated messages. My mother aggressively coordinating the RSVPs. Martha is in. Thomas is in. Megan says yes if there is free, expensive wine. My father was significantly quieter, mostly dealing with the logistics, parking, reservation times, exactly how to carefully frame the invitation so it sounded like a casual, loving olive branch. And then I read the specific messages that turned my stomach completely cold. Mom, sent 10 days ago. The bank aggressively called again on Thursday. We absolutely have to figure something out before the end of June, or we lose it. Dad's reply, Serena can easily cover our debts through the spring. She's got more than enough corporate money. And finally, the specific text message that hit me like a bag of heavy gravel dropped from a high shelf. Mom, again, sent 8 days ago. We're not begging for money. It is not an ask. We are graciously letting her back into the family fold. She should be deeply, profoundly grateful we are even giving her this chance to redeem herself. Grateful. They genuinely, arrogantly wanted me to be grateful for the rare privilege of being maliciously tricked into a massive 16-person dinner at an outrageously expensive restaurant I couldn't have picked for myself. Specifically, so I could blindly pay a massive bill I didn't order, to solve a severe financial crisis absolutely nobody had bothered to tell me about. All for a toxic family that violently cut me out of their lives the very last time I dared to say the word no. I slowly set Harper's phone back down on the cold marble counter, screen facing down, placing it exactly where I had found it. I meticulously washed and dried my hands. I looked at myself directly in that flattering, golden mirror, and I thought with crystal clarity, I know exactly what you are doing out there. I know exactly what this manipulation costs. And for the absolute first time in 15 years, I am not going to pay the bill. I stood entirely still in that luxurious, marble-lined bathroom, holding the devastating truth in both of my shaking hands. And the absolute strangest part of that entire moment was how profoundly, remarkably calm I suddenly felt. I wasn't emotionally numb. I wasn't blindingly angry. I was simply beautifully clear. It was the exact same feeling of hyperfocus that descends upon a massive commercial kitchen right before a brutal Friday night dinner rush. Every single station is fully prepped, absolutely nothing is wasted, and everyone is exactly in position. If you have ever agonizingly discovered that you are only loved for exactly what you could financially provide, and not for who you actually are as a human being, then you know exactly how cold that polished tile floor felt underneath my shoes. I walked slowly back to the private dining alcove, wearing the exact same professional expression I wear when a strict health inspector arrives entirely unannounced at one of my properties. Pleasant, totally unreadable, and fully operational. Absolutely nobody at the table noticed anything different about my demeanor. Aunt Martha was loudly telling a pointless story about her neighbor's bitter divorce. Uncle Thomas was aggressively working his way through his third colossal lobster tail. Harper had eagerly reclaimed her glowing phone from the restroom and was furiously scrolling again, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just handed me the master key to my own freedom. But sitting there, I began to notice subtle, telling things that I hadn't let myself actively see before. My mother, Evelyn, kept nervously glancing at my father's heavy leather wallet resting on the tablecloth. Quick, anxious little flicks of her eyes, exactly like she was silently checking a ticking countdown clock. My father's booming laugh was consistently half a beat too loud, the exact way desperate people laugh when they are secretly terrified and trying to aggressively cover it with sheer volume. The second bottle of vintage Cabernet was nearly empty, and absolutely nobody had suggested slowing down the expensive ordering. Because why on earth would they? They firmly believed they weren't paying. I was paying. That was the entire manipulative point of the evening. And every single bite of premium lobster, every sizzling cut of wagyu beef, every heavy pour of that $500 Bordeaux was just another heavy brick in the towering wall they were trying to build around me. A wall high enough that I couldn't possibly climb out without making the massive, public scene I had spent my entire adult life desperately avoiding. The dessert menus finally arrived. Aunt Martha immediately ordered the expensive vanilla bean creme brulee without even a passing glance at the price column on the right. Harper eagerly asked for the signature dark chocolate souffle, a complex dessert which required a strict 20-minute lead time in the kitchen, which meant she had arrogantly ordered it before I had even sat down at the table. Of course she had. They were aggressively running up the massive tab the exact way you run up a tab when a wealthy stranger is footing the bill. Without a ceiling, without an ounce of guilt, without a single moment of hesitation. My glass of sparkling water was down to the melting ice. Harper was the one who finally cracked the fragile surface of the evening. She had aggressively consumed 3 large glasses of the heavy Bordeaux by then, more than enough alcohol to completely dissolve whatever thin filter she normally kept between her brain and her mouth. She leaned entirely across the table, her wine glass swaying in her hand, and grinned at me exactly like we were sharing a hilarious private joke. Just relax, big sister. It is just a family dinner. We all know you can easily afford it. I slowly set my water glass down on the crisp linen. Afford what exactly, Harper? This, she said loudly, gesturing wildly at the entire table. The demolished seafood towers, the empty wine bottles, the 16 elegant place settings, the expensive creme brulee, and the chocolate souffle, currently being meticulously prepared by a busy kitchen that had absolutely no idea it was catering a coordinated shakedown. We deliberately ordered the really good stuff tonight, since you're generously treating the family. She said it so incredibly casually. Since you're treating, like it had been firmly, legally settled in a corporate board meeting I wasn't even invited to attend. Which, of course, it had been. The massive table went dead silent for exactly 3 seconds. That absolutely doesn't sound like a very long time, until you are the one sitting in the exact center of it. Evelyn shot Harper a terrified look that explicitly said, "Too early." Harper simply shrugged her shoulders, exactly like she had accidentally bumped a cheap vase she didn't plan to pick up. Uncle Thomas intensely studied the remaining shell of his lobster. Aunt Martha suddenly found her white cloth napkin absolutely fascinating. My father loudly cleared his throat. The agonizing silence lasted just long enough for Julian, the young waiter, to silently arrive with a fresh, chilled bottle of sparkling water. He placed it gently beside my glass, and in that exact moment, I realized two profound things. First, that Julian was the absolute only person at this 16-seat table who had poured me something tonight without expecting a massive financial return. And second, that my sister Harper had just arrogantly confirmed out loud what every single person in this room already secretly knew. I was the mark. This entire dinner was an emotional heist, and every empty lobster tail was physical evidence. What happened next was an accident, and I genuinely almost felt bad for my cousin Megan when it landed. She was desperately trying to make polite conversation. Genuinely, I think, because Megan was the absolute only family member who had bothered to send me a short birthday text during year 2 of the silence. So, Serena, my mother nervously interjected, trying to save the moment. Megan said you got a massive corporate promotion recently. Something about running a bunch of those fancy restaurants now. I kept my answer entirely simple. Regional Director of Operations. I oversee 6 locations. Megan nodded, genuinely impressed. That is amazing, Serena. So, you are completely in charge of all of them. Staffing, vendor contracts, corporate compliance, P&L financials, absolutely everything from the loading dock deliveries to the final guest check, I said. I delivered the words the exact same way I would present them in a high-level executive meeting. Factual, direct, no polish. But the specific word financials landed on that dining table exactly like a heavy rock thrown through a glass window. Aunt Martha's silver fork completely stopped in midair. Uncle Thomas slowly looked up from his messy plate for the first time in 20 minutes. Harper's scrolling thumb violently froze on her screen. Even my father shifted uncomfortably in his heavy chair, his brain visibly reweighing and recalculating the situation. They knew I was highly successful. They had built their entire greedy evening around the firm assumption that I was successful enough to blindly pay. But actually hearing it, the massive scope, the ultimate authority, the terrifying specificity of what I actually did for a living, was entirely different from blindly assuming it. They had pictured me as a highly paid, lucky waitress. They absolutely had not pictured a ruthless corporate executive who could read a complex profit and loss statement significantly faster than they could read a dessert menu. An executive who managed vendor contracts worth significantly more than their entire houses. An expert who knew exactly, down to the absolute penny, what 16 lobster tails and 2 bottles of Grand Cru Bordeaux cost before the final check ever printed. The entire table visibly recalibrated. I could physically feel it happening, exactly like a rapid change in barometric pressure. The power dynamic hadn't completely shifted yet, but it had severely loosened. My father waited until the dessert course to make his final, desperate move. He was highly strategic about it, I will give him that. The chocolate souffle had beautifully arrived. The sugar crust on the cream brulee was cracked, and the second expensive bottle of Bordeaux was resting upside down in the silver ice bucket. The table was incredibly warm, entirely full, and sluggishly slow with heavy sugar and rich wine. Every face was soft with the very particular, smug satisfaction that only comes from consuming a massive, expensive meal you absolutely didn't pay for and don't ever intend to. Richard slowly set down his silver dessert fork. He carefully folded his hands together on the very edge of the white tablecloth, a dominant gesture I had seen him make 1,000 times before signing bad contracts, before delivering arrogant speeches at Thanksgiving, and before aggressively telling me at 23 that he needed a cosigner. He looked directly at me, not unkindly and not cruelly. He looked at me with a highly particular, confident expression of an arrogant man who firmly believes he is being entirely reasonable. "Well, Serena," he smiled, his voice booming. "You're paying the bill tonight, right? After everything, you absolutely owe us that much. You owe us that much." 16 people clearly heard those exact words. Julian, who was quietly refilling Aunt Martha's dark coffee directly behind me, heard them. The wealthy couple at the adjacent table, who were aggressively pretending not to listen, clearly heard them. My mother nodded encouragingly. My sister smirked. My aunt reached for another pat of butter, exactly like the matter was legally settled. You owe us for 3 years of your silence. And not one single person sitting at that massive table had said they were sorry. Not one had admitted they were wrong. Not one had missed me for any actual reason other than the massive credit limit attached to my name. You owe us that much. I looked directly at my father across a table completely covered in the expensive wreckage of a meal I absolutely hadn't ordered. I was completely surrounded by a toxic family I hadn't even been told was coming, holding a simple glass of water I had quietly poured myself. And I felt something I absolutely hadn't expected to feel. Pure, unadulterated relief. Because the agonizing decision I had been terrified to make for the last 15 years had just been completely, effortlessly made for me. I didn't answer him right away. I have learned in the corporate world that absolute, dead silence does significantly more heavy lifting than words ever could in a room full of arrogant people who are entirely used to being agreed with. 3 agonizing seconds. 5 seconds. The exact kind of suffocating silence that makes a table of 16 people shift nervously in their chairs, frantically reach for their water glasses, and suddenly remember they have something incredibly interesting to look at on the blank wall behind me. For 15 long years, I had always desperately paid the bill, so absolutely no one would ever make a scene. I had picked up every single restaurant check, co-signed every bad loan, covered every missed deposit, and paid every dental bill, because the terrifying cost of saying no was a room exactly like this one. A room completely full of staring, expecting, angry faces. A room full of the unspoken, toxic understanding that Serena's family love was strictly measured in dollar signs, and Serena's compliance was permanently purchased with emotional guilt. 15 years, tens of thousands of dollars, and the ultimate price of admission to remain in my own family had just been proudly announced to the entire room at roughly $80 a plate, plus vintage wine, plus imported lobster, plus the particular, agonizing tax that comes with being the designated child they only ever call when something needs massive funding. I looked directly at my father's hands, still arrogantly folded, still entirely steady. I looked at my mother's wide eyes, still warmly, desperately performing. I looked at Harper, who was already lazily scrolling on her phone again, because as far as her delusional brain was concerned, this financial transaction was completely decided. I looked at Julian, standing quietly by the service station, watching our table with the careful, hyper-alert attention of a young man who knows something incredibly important is happening, but isn't quite sure what. Then I looked down at my glass of sparkling water, half full, catching the warm candlelight exactly like a small, quiet promise I had finally kept to myself. I slowly placed my white cloth napkin perfectly on the table. I smiled my best corporate smile. "Let me go take care of things," I said smoothly, and I stood up. My mother audibly exhaled in massive relief. Aunt Martha dramatically patted her chest. My father proudly unfolded his hands. Every single one of them genuinely thought I was walking to the front register to blindly pay the massive bill. Here is the absolute truth that 15 years behind a luxury host stand teaches you. The person who entirely controls the restaurant check entirely controls the room. My family falsely thought they controlled the room. They had manipulatively set the table, chosen the expensive restaurant, ordered the gluttonous menu, assembled the captive audience, and confidently delivered the financial demand. They had 16 people, 2 empty bottles of vintage wine, and 3 years of built-up, agonizing pressure on their side. I had exactly 2 short sentences and an exhausted waiter named Julian. If a quiet, unshakable boundary has ever completely changed the entire trajectory of your life, if you have ever boldly walked into a crowded room where absolutely everyone expected you to emotionally fold, and you fiercely refused, hit that subscribe button right now, because you're going to love exactly how this one lands. I absolutely did not walk toward the front register. I walked directly toward the back service station, where Julian was frantically organizing leather check presenters and a senior floor manager named David was quietly reviewing a printed ticket. David wore the standard luxury uniform: crisp black shirt, silk tie, discreet earpiece, and he had the hardened look of a seasoned man who had been in the brutal industry long enough to easily handle absolutely whatever nightmare walked up to him. I walked directly up to him. "Excuse me, David," I said softly. He turned immediately, flashing a flawless professional smile. "How can I assist you tonight, ma'am?" I kept my voice incredibly low. Not dramatic, not secretive. Just the exact, precise volume you use in the hospitality industry when you are efficiently handling a massive problem that absolutely does not need the dining room's attention. Julian was standing right beside him, listening intently, a heavy tray balanced flawlessly on his hip. Both of them looked at me the exact way restaurant professionals look at someone who clearly speaks their native language, with immediate, precise, undivided attention. I said exactly 2 sentences. "I am absolutely not the host of that party, and I will absolutely not be covering the check for that table tonight. Please bring the full, unsplit check directly to the gentleman sitting at the head of the table, the older man whose major credit card is already on file for the reservation." David blinked exactly once. He glanced at Julian, then back at me. "And the second thing," I continued smoothly, "please split off exactly 1 glass of sparkling water onto a separate check for me. Run my personal card for the water, and please add a 30% cash tip to my check for your incredible team. You have absolutely earned it tonight." Julian's exhausted eyes widened slightly in pure shock. David looked at me intensely for 3 full seconds, reading the complex situation the exact way a brilliant floor manager reads every situation. Fast, incredibly thorough, and completely without moral judgment. Then he gave a sharp nod. Done. That was absolutely it. No argument, no hesitation, no annoying. "Are you completely sure about this, ma'am?" Because David had been managing restaurants long enough to know exactly what a desperate, targeted redirect looked like. And Julian had been watching that toxic table long enough to deeply understand exactly why one was needed. I paid my tiny check right there on the spot. 1 sparkling water, plus a massive 30% tip on the entire table's presumed total. It would easily be the largest tip Julian had received in a month. David efficiently ran my card, handed me the printed receipt, and said quietly, "I will present the main check to the gentleman at the table in exactly 10 minutes, once the dessert plates are cleared." "Perfect," I whispered. I confidently walked back to the massive table, sat down in my chair, picked up my sparkling water, and took a slow, refreshing sip. Harper was loudly arguing with Cousin Tyler about a trashy reality show. Aunt Martha was complaining to Uncle Thomas about her neighbor's terrible landscaping. My mother was watching me with the careful, relaxed attention of someone who firmly thinks the massive bill has been successfully handled. My father was leaning far back in his chair, his arms arrogantly crossed, looking completely satisfied with his victory. 16 people, aggressively eating rich dessert, drinking the absolute last drops of a $500 bottle of wine, blindly waiting for a massive bill they had absolutely no intention of ever seeing. I set my glass down on the linen and waited with them. Those 10 minutes were easily the most profoundly peaceful minutes of my entire life. The massive table absolutely didn't know it yet, but the meal was entirely over in every single way that actually mattered. The food was consumed, the wine was gone, the manipulative ask had been aggressively made, and the final answer had already been devastatingly delivered in a language none of them could possibly speak. I sat quietly at my end of the table and just listened to my family talk. I almost felt a flicker of emotion. Almost. But then I looked directly at my father, who was anxiously checking his phone under the table with the tight-jawed focus of a desperate man waiting for a bank text he didn't want to receive. And I clearly remembered the exact message I had read on Harper's abandoned phone. "Serena can easily cover our debts through the spring. She's got more than enough." My sparkling water caught the warm candlelight again. I watched the tiny bubbles rise and pop one by one. I thought about 17-year-old Serena in her greasy apron, learning to desperately smile through the burning pain in her shoulders. That terrified girl would have paid the bill. That girl would have pulled out her credit card, covered the $2,000 table, called it family love, gone home, cried violently in the shower, and never told a single soul. I wasn't that terrified girl anymore. Julian quietly appeared at the very edge of the alcove, and I knew exactly whose chair he was walking toward before he even took his first step. He placed the heavy, leather-bound check presenter, beautifully embossed with the Obsidian Room's gold logo, directly in front of my father, not in the center of the table, not near me, directly in front of Richard Vance, the man who had confidently made the reservation, whose credit card was on file, and who had loudly told the entire table to put it all on this 2 hours ago. The loud table conversation violently died exactly like a candle snuffed out in a draft. My father stared at the black leather folio for 2 agonizing seconds. I could literally see his brain frantically processing the error. The check was supposed to go to Serena. The check was supposed to go to Serena. Why is the check in front of me? Evelyn's eyes went incredibly wide. She looked at me, then at the heavy check, then at me again, and for the absolute first time all night, her flawless composure completely cracked enough to show the terrifying math running behind her eyes. Serena, she started, her voice trembling. Richard recovered first. He was incredibly good at recovering. He had spent 63 years absolutely never admitting he was caught off guard. He picked up the leather check presenter, opened it with a casual flick of his wrist, and absolutely did not look at the printed total. He couldn't look at the total. If he looked at the massive total in front of 16 people, the illusion of his wealth would end. "I've got it," he announced loudly, pulling his credit card from his wallet with the exact same 2-finger magical flourish he had used earlier. He handed the card blindly to Julian without breaking furious eye contact with me. "We're celebrating, remember." Julian gently took the card. "I will be right back, sir." He said it incredibly gently, the exact way you say things when you know exactly what a humiliating disaster is about to happen and the arrogant person you're talking to doesn't. My father leaned back, aggressively crossed his arms, and smiled at me with the full, delusional confidence of a man who genuinely believed his plastic card would miraculously save him. Julian came back in exactly 4 minutes. He stood directly beside my father's chair. He leaned down and said, at a volume perfectly designed to be discreet, but easily heard by a massive table that had gone silent enough to hear a pin drop, "I am incredibly sorry, sir. The card has been completely declined." Absolutely nobody moved a muscle. My father's arrogant smile held for exactly 1 more second, a physical reflex, like a light bulb that stays glowing for a moment after you flip the switch. Then it completely went out. "Run it again," he demanded, his voice dropping. Julian nodded and disappeared. He came back in exactly 2 minutes. Same gentle lean, same polite voice. "I am sorry, sir. It is still completely rejecting. Would you perhaps like to try another card?" My father frantically reached for his leather wallet. His shaking fingers moved desperately through the tight slots. 1 card, then another, then a 3rd faded card he violently pulled from behind his driver's license. Exactly like a last, desperate bullet in a chamber he had forgotten he loaded. He handed it to Julian. The massive table was deafeningly silent. 16 people. Absolutely no forks moving. No wine being poured. No laughter. Just the agonizing sound of Richard Vance's 63 years of massive pride violently compressing into a cheap wallet he couldn't close fast enough. Julian came back a 3rd time. He didn't even need to speak. His deeply sympathetic face said it all. My father looked at Julian. Then he slowly looked down the table at me. Not with anger. Not yet. With the raw, completely unguarded expression of a terrified man who has just realized, in front of absolutely every person who matters to him, that the financial net he had been maliciously counting on was completely gone, and the concrete ground was exactly as hard as he had always feared. He looked at me the exact way you look at a lifeboat that is actively pulling away from a sinking ship. I picked up my sparkling water, took a final sip, and set it down. I don't owe you anything, Dad. I never did. My father's heavy chair scraped violently back against the hardwood floor with a sound exactly like tearing paper. Serena. His voice was low, heavily controlled, but violently shaking at the edges. What on earth did you do? I absolutely didn't do anything, Dad. Your credit card was declined. That is entirely between you and your bank. You were supposed to. He stopped himself, but absolutely not fast enough. The devastating sentence hung in the air, completely unfinished, visible to everyone. You were supposed to pay. My mother started crying. Not the quiet, genuine kind. The highly performative kind. The kind with dramatic gasps and dabbing napkins and enough sheer volume to desperately recruit sympathy from adjacent tables. After absolutely everything we have done for you, after I birthed and carried you, how could you sit there and humiliate us? What exactly did you do for me, Mom? My voice was completely level. I didn't raise it a single decibel. I didn't lean forward. I stayed perfectly still in my chair, my hands calmly around my water glass. Tell me right now, in front of everyone, what exactly did you do for me in the last 3 years of silence? Harper slammed her hand violently on the table. This is so incredibly typical. You always have to make absolutely everything about you and your stupid money. Aunt Martha nervously reached for my arm. Serena, dear, your father is clearly deeply embarrassed. Can't you just cover it? No, exactly one word. I said it the exact same way I would say it to a fraudulent vendor who tried to short my corporate invoice. Crystal clear, entirely final, and completely without apology. Then my father finally broke. Not with anger this time, but with something infinitely worse. His voice dropped completely, and for one single, terrible, honest moment, he sounded exactly like a terrified man standing alone in a house with all the lights turned off. Serena, please. We are completely drowning. I finally saw him. I saw the terrified man hiding behind the arrogant performance. The desperate father who had completely lost his business and his pride and couldn't say it out loud until his plastic credit card said it for him. I saw him and I deeply ached. But then he immediately added, "And you're just going to sit there and let us." And the empathy instantly stopped, because even while actively drowning, he was still reaching aggressively for my wallet instead of my hand. I stood up. Not fast, not dramatic. The exact way you stand up when you have made your final decision, and you absolutely do not need the room's permission to leave. Dad, I am genuinely sorry you are struggling. I truly mean that. But this. I gestured broadly at the table, the empty lobster shells, the upside-down wine bottles, the 16 faces watching me exactly like I was the villain in a stage play they had rehearsed all week. This isn't asking for my help. This is an ambush. You didn't invite me here to make amends. You invited me here to make a payment. My mother's crying shifted into something significantly harder and meaner. That is absolutely not fair, Serena. We just desperately wanted you back in the family. You desperately wanted me back for exactly what I could cover financially, Mom. I read the group chat messages. Serena can easily cover us through the spring. We aren't begging. She should be grateful. The entire table went completely white. Harper's face instantly drained of all blood. My mother's hand flew to her mouth in pure horror. My father stared blankly at the white tablecloth. If you desperately need help, real, actual help, I will gladly sit down with you and a licensed financial counselor, and we will figure out a realistic plan. No psychological tricks, no massive audience, no imported lobster. But I am absolutely not paying this bill. I didn't order it. I wasn't told about it. And I absolutely do not owe it to you. I don't owe you anything. I never did. Absolutely nobody spoke a single word. I picked up my purse. I looked directly at my mother, and I said the absolute last thing I would ever say to her at that table. You always loved telling me that family takes care of family, Mom. So why on earth was I the absolute only one who ever did? Then I turned and walked toward the door. I walked past the busser, past the shocked hostess, past the heavy glass doors with the brass handles. Julian caught me right near the coat check. "Ma'am," he whispered. He was holding my printed receipt. "Thank you." He said it incredibly quietly with total sincerity. I gently touched his shoulder. "You're doing great tonight," I told him again. Then I walked out into the cool night air. The sprawling parking lot was quiet. A warm Thursday evening, the cicadas just starting up in the exotic landscape trees that made the Obsidian Room look like it belonged somewhere significantly more important than a suburban strip mall. I sat silently in my car, the engine completely off, the windows rolled down, and I read the yellow sticky note still pressed to my steering wheel. One dinner, then home. One dinner. I pulled my glowing phone from my purse and opened the family group chat. The furious messages were already flooding in like a tsunami. Mom, Aunt Martha, Harper, all of them typing furiously at once. A massive cascade of exclamation points, vicious accusations, and the highly particular kind of screaming fury that only ever comes from toxic people who have finally been caught. I absolutely didn't read a single one of them. I calmly scrolled to the very bottom of the screen, firmly tapped Leave Group, and watched the small notification confirm my absolute freedom. Serena Vance has left the chat. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. I finally started the engine, and I drove home in the exact same silence I had driven there. Except this time, the silence wasn't nervous or terrifying. The silence was finally mine. The aftermath was significantly quieter than I ever expected. Nobody called that night, or the next day, or the day after that. The group chat I had left continued entirely without me. I know this because my cousin Megan, the only one who had sent the birthday text, reached out to me separately exactly a week later. "I just wanted you to know," she wrote. "That was the absolute most honest thing anyone has done at a family dinner in 20 years. I am deeply sorry I was a part of it." Megan was the only one who ever apologized. 3 weeks later, Harper texted me, not to apologize, but to audaciously ask if I could lend her first and last month's rent for a new luxury apartment. I calmly replied with the phone number of a local financial counseling service and wished her well. She absolutely never responded. Through Megan, I eventually learned the rest of the truth in broken pieces over the following months. My father's commercial contracting business had completely folded 18 months before the dinner. Bad bets on 2 massive projects that went completely sideways. My mother had been desperately covering the minimum payments on 4 different credit cards with a home equity line that was now completely maxed out. Their massive house went on the market in late July. They were forced to move to a significantly smaller rental in a working-class town 30 minutes south. Harper was forced to take a regular job at a local dentist's office, answering phones for minimum wage. Absolutely none of it was what I genuinely wanted for them. But absolutely all of it was the direct, inevitable consequence of arrogant choices they had aggressively made long before I ever walked into the Obsidian Room. And absolutely none of it was mine to fix. I did exactly what I had promised at the table. I called my father exactly 6 weeks later and offered to sit with him and a financial counselor to help organize his bankruptcy. He violently hung up the phone on me. I haven't called again, but the quiet offer still stands. I learned the incredibly hard way that the absolute most expensive thing you can ever buy in this life is other people's comfort with your own silence. And the night I finally stopped paying for their comfort was the exact night I finally became truly rich. That is my story. 16 seats, 1 glass of sparkling water, and a plastic credit card that finally told the devastating truth absolutely nobody else would. If you have ever been the designated family bank, please hear me right now. Helping someone is a gift and a choice, not an emotional debt. And a firm boundary absolutely doesn't have to be loud to be completely unbreakable. Share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.